The Subcommittee on the Federal Workforce, Postal Service, and the District of Columbia hearing will now come to order. I welcome my friend, Ranking Member Mr. Chaffetz of Utah, members of the Subcommittee, hearing witnesses, and all those in attendance. The purpose of today's hearing is to review the existing temporary hiring authorities and current regulations and the resulting impact on temporary employees' status and benefit offerings. The Chair, the Ranking Member, and the Subcommittee members will each have 5 minutes within which to make an opening statement, and all members will have 3 days to submit statements for the record. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the duty of this subcommittee to look after every single federal employee, no matter the level of pay or what type of schedule or seniority they may have. I've called today's hearing to discuss issues relating to temporary employees who represent about 9% of the total federal workforce. We know that seasonal temporary employees play a critical role in helping an agency accomplish its mission and carry out its mandates, yet these employees are operating largely under the radar screen. Given the fact that in certain federal entities, namely the National Park Service and the Forest Service, seasonal temporary employees can comprise approximately 40% of the workforce at any given time. It is important that we take time to seriously consider issues and concerns currently confronting this particular employee population. Oftentimes, seasonal temporary employees have worked in the same capacity year after year, decade after decade. However, they receive no health care, retirement, insurance, or other regular benefits accrued by otherwise permanent or term employees of the federal government. While in the early 1990s, regulatory changes were made to reduce temporary employees' assignment time from 4 years to a maximum of total of 2, thereby limiting the possibility of temporary employee abuses, it is clear that renewed oversight on this issue is needed. As we explore existing temporary hiring authorities and current regulations, I believe it's important that we consider whether a path to permanency can be established for our temporary employees, many of whom have worked for multiple years and are fully cognizant of the merit principles in our hiring. Additionally, we need to look at how we can harness the sizable talent and information acquired by these temporary employees. Today's hearing will also provide us the chance to hear from the employer as well as the employee side of the temporary hiring issue. My intent is for this afternoon's hearing to provide all of us with an opportunity to further the dialogue on various ideas and suggestions on how we can best reach a middle ground on some of these issues so that our employees are properly taken care of without agency budget being overly stretched. It's my hope that the testimony and feedback we receive from today's witnesses will provide the subcommittee with precise guidance and direction. Again, I thank each of you for being with us this afternoon, and I look forward to your participation. I now yield to the Ranking Member, Mr. Chaffetz, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here, and the preparation put forward. This testimony is important as we dive into this issue. Temporary employees provide federal agencies with flexibility needed to handle temporary increases in workload, such as seasonal work and short-term projects, or to hire people to fill in behind permanent employees as an extended leave of absence, such as parental leave. These positions are not intended to be used as tryouts or as substitutes to buffer the full-time workforce. Congress and the Office of Personnel Management must continue to work diligently to ensure that agencies comply with the statutory and regulatory framework and limitations on the use of temporary workers. At the same time, any statutory or regulatory change must be approached with caution to ensure that an effective workforce, while limiting spending and maintaining the flexibility this system is intended to provide. In 1998, the last time the Office of Personnel Management estimated the cost of extending health and pension benefits to temporary workers, it estimated the total cost of providing these benefits to the 102,000 plus temporary employees would be in excess of $784 million. Today, there's something like in the ballpark of 183,000 temporary workers, and like all federal employees, their salaries have grown significantly since 1998. In a year when the federal deficit is projected to exceed last year's record high of $1.4 trillion, and unemployment is in the range of 9.7% across the country, a $1 billion increase in spending would be obviously irresponsible. I look forward to hearing suggestions from today's witnesses on how the Office of Personnel Management and Congress can work together to ensure agencies use temporary workers in accordance with standing regulations and statutes. I look forward to the interaction, and again, I thank you for being here. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for this hearing and regret that this hearing is necessary because this issue came up not shortly after I came to Congress almost 20 years ago, and I wonder if we're seeing progress. I note that the number of temporary employees has gone up. That doesn't in and of itself bother me because there are increasing numbers of temporary employees, and they are it's a very satisfactory status to many people. But I think at this hearing, we need to find out whether temporary status is being abused or if it simply doesn't work the way we are implementing it. I am particularly concerned, Mr. Chairman, that in the year in which we have just passed a monumentally historic health care reform bill, these workers apparently still cannot get access to health care unless they pay for it entirely. I cannot understand how anybody working for the federal government would be put in that position for any period of time, and we'll be very interested to know whether or not the health care bill we just passed makes any difference with respect to that status. Very concerning, too, is the lack of any retirement benefits. Now, a time limit was put on the number of years you could serve as a temporary employee, and I don't have objections to that. But I'm wondering. The reason I don't have objections to it, at least as it stands now, is that we want to preserve the merit system as the way to hire employees. On the other hand, I'm troubled by reports of temporary employees who are working far longer than the 2-year limit because that can be waived. And I think the reason probably is that their experience is needed. I do join the ranking member in understanding the need for flexibility here, but flexibility should not come with abuse. There was the case that first led to reforms involved a man from the District of Columbia who worked 3 shifts over July 4th and dropped dead from it. He had a wife and 5 or 6 children and nothing to show for it. I went to the floor with a bill, and a bill for a single individual is very rare in this House, but the House and the Senate saw this as not only a signal that there was reform needed, but that something had to be done for this man, and we were able to get some funds for him. I regret to see now that perhaps too little was done, and hope to learn more from this hearing about what more needs to be done consistent with maintaining the flexibility of temporary employment, which is employment that is not only to the benefit of the federal government, but many others who work in part-time positions as well. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for continuing to tackle one of the more intractable challenges facing our federal workforce. Widespread agency abuse of temporary hiring practices is both a symptom of a broken hiring system and an ongoing impediment to the long-range recruitment and retention of the high-caliber employees we need in the federal government. The Office of Personnel Management needs to use its administrative authority to the maximum extent possible to crack down on agencies' abuse of temporary hiring as a logical accompaniment to the implementation of the President's recently announced hiring reforms, which I, for one, welcome. One reform OPM could implement would be to close the loophole allowing repeated temporary hires of seasonal employees who work less than 6 months in a year. Temporary hiring has all too frequently been abused as a de facto means of retaining long-term employees to save money in the short run at the expense of both the federal employee and federal efficiency in the long run. It's not surprising that agencies use temporary hiring authorities, including the misnamed Federal Career Internship Program, to fill employment positions since the current hiring process is so inefficient. Fortunately, President Obama and OPM Director Berry are taking aggressive steps to reform that process by eliminating KSA essay requirements and streamlining hiring on USA jobs. These reforms will allow agencies to fill job positions more readily with permanent employees hired under merit principles. For their part, agencies must take advantage of the opportunity and begin making progress to reverse the 25,000 position growth in temporary employment that occurred between 1992 and 2009. I look forward to hearing the Forest Service plans for reforming abuse of temporary hiring authority. An extraordinary 53% of Forest Service employees who responded to a National Federation of Federal Employees survey said that they'd been temporarily hired for 5 or more seasons, even though the Merit System Protection Board advised that temporary employment policy should be based on the assumption that the employment will normally be on a one-time, short-duration basis. Many of these temporary employees are in fact long-term dedicated public servants. For example, Forest Service fire crews who serve year after year, from June to October, or longer, may be seasonal, but they surely are not temporary. Many of these Forest Service positions involve hard, dangerous labor. It's morally repugnant to exploit temporary hiring authority to avoid providing Forest Service employees the benefits that in fact they've earned through what is frequently long-term service and certainly dangerous. This is not principally an issue of workers' rights, however, but rather federal efficiency and productivity. We must remain focused on recruiting and retaining the best employees in what is frequently a very competitive job market. In order to recruit and retain the best employees who will serve our constituents, we must ensure that agencies are offering basic benefits rather than long-term temporary employment that does an injustice to both federal employees and, in the long run, the taxpayers themselves. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Again, I want to welcome our witnesses. It is the custom before this committee that all witnesses are sworn. Could I ask you to please rise and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give to this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Okay, let the record indicate that all of the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. What I will do is offer a brief introduction of the witnesses, and then each will be afforded 5 minutes for an opening statement. Just for the beginning, the small boxes in front of you on the table will indicate green while your time is proceeding, then yellow when it's time to wrap up, and then red when you should stop testifying. And let me begin. Mr. Jerry Simpson began his federal career with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in 1967. In 2006, he left NASA to join the National Park Service. Mr. Simpson currently serves as the Associate Director of Workforce Management for the National Park Service, where his duties include ensuring effective utilization of federal employees, concession employees, cooperators, contractors, and volunteers. Mr. Hank Cashton has served the National Forest Service for 35 years and is currently the Forest Service's Associate Chief. During his tenure with the Forest Service, Mr. Cashton has served in a variety of roles, including his appointment as Deputy Chief for Business Operations. Ms. Angela Bailey was selected for the Senior Executive Service in October of 2007 after 26 years of public service. She currently serves as Deputy Associate Director for the Recruitment and Diversity at the Office of Personnel Management. Prior to joining the Office of Personnel Management, Ms. Bailey worked for the Social Security Administration and the Department of Defense. Mr. Simpson, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss issues facing temporary employees. In the interest of time, I'll
Mr. Simpson, is your microphone on? I'm not sure.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, take it from the top. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to appear today to discuss issues facing temporary employees. In the interest of time, I'll summarize my written testimony and then answer questions you may have. For many years, the Park Service has relied heavily on a seasonal workforce to augment its permanent staff. Today, we hire approximately 10,000 seasonal employees every year to provide critical services, especially during peak summer visitation. The variety of positions that we hire includes maintenance workers, rangers, both law enforcement protection and interpretation, fee collectors, biological technicians, landscape architects, firefighters, lifeguards, just to name a few. Seasonal positions in the Park Service are very competitive, and the number of applicants usually far exceeds the number of available positions. We use temporary hiring authorities to fill many of these positions, often through open competitive examination procedures. However, we may also give temporary appointments non-competitively to certain individuals, and we do make use of the Student Educational Employment Program to non-competitively fill positions performing seasonal work. The Park Service is concerned about the morale and the equitable treatment of our seasonal workforce. Because the employee viewpoint survey conducted by OPM is only distributed to permanent employees, we recently completed a comparable internal survey distributed to approximately 6,000 of our employees who were hired after June 2009, including seasonal employees. According to the survey, our seasonal employees, like their permanent coworkers, derive very high satisfaction from their belief that the work they do is important and that they like the work that they do. Their greatest dissatisfiers, however, are with the lack of health and retirement benefits, the lack of job security, and the lack of equity with permanent staff, particularly where promotions and within-grade pay increases are at stake. Approximately 43% of those survey respondents indicated they were considering leaving the Park Service within the next year. We have formed an internal work group to help address these issues, and we will actively be working those in the coming year within existing regulatory and budgetary constraints. Though seasonal employees are not eligible for participation in the Federal Employees Health Benefits Program, we do make available to all of our seasonal employees when they first start work information about private health insurance that is available to them through the Association for National Park Rangers, which is a nonprofit employee organization. We are vigilant in monitoring our use of temporaries. We conduct multiple audits annually to ensure compliance with the temporary hiring laws, regulations, and the time limits imposed on these appointments by OPM guidelines. Over the past 3 years, the Park Service has conducted between 15 and 20 of these reviews with an OPM staff member as a member of each review team, and we have found no major compliance issues in these areas. So in summary, the use of temporary hiring authorities is critical to the Park Service. They play a role in our seasonal recruitment efforts, and they allow us to meet our NPS mission. We strive to ensure that our use of authorities is in compliance with civil service laws and regulations, but we would welcome the opportunity to work with the committee and other agencies and departments to explore potential solutions to the issues that will be discussed today. So, Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared remarks, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Cashman, welcome. You now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Lynch, Mr. Bilbray, Ms. Norton, Mr. Connolly. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about a very critical segment of the workforce that delivers the Forest Service mission, that being the temporary seasonal workforce. In addressing the subcommittee's concerns about temporary hiring authorities and benefits, legislative issues, and qualification for permanent jobs, I think it's important to just lay out an employment profile for the agency. At any given time in the Forest Service, we'll have up to about 30,000 career employees. At this time of the year, the end of June, early July, we'll increase that number to almost 45,000, adding 15,000 temporary seasonals to the workforce, and that typically hits its height right about this time of the year. These employees are primarily field employees. They'll work in wildlife habitat management, watershed restoration, recreation management, forest products, and the big employer being wildfire suppression. Our field seasons vary. In the southern tier of the United States, that field season may last all year. In the Northeast and the Northwest, as well as Alaska, that field season can be fairly short, 3 and 4 months. So in addressing the question of how long does a temporary last, I'd like to address it from a strictly plain and simple business model standpoint, as well as an empathetic standpoint, trying to put myself in the shoes of a temporary employee. From the business model standpoint, I think there are some basic attributes that we have to consider. Most of the Forest Service field work is in fact seasonal. winter type or non-season office work is different than seasonal field work. As an executive in the agency that manages the workforce, I think there's an important aspect of the budget profile that necessitates having a reasonable level of discretionary costs compared to fixed costs. As an executive, I look at 20 to 30% of our budget profile being discretionary as a reasonable level to achieve. Seasonal employees are in the discretionary category along with grants, agreements, contracts, and procurement. Permanent employees would be in the fixed cost category along with infrastructure. Now, that's the very plain and simple budget profile. In the workforce profile, it's very important for the agency's employment profile to represent a variety of sources from which employees are derived. This includes veterans, interns in college, placements from Job Corps, Presidential Management Fellows, returning Peace Corps volunteers, and from the ranks of seasonal workforce. And let me just add that seasonal workforce provides about 44% of our current career workforce in the agency, so it's the single largest component. Now, that's the business model that I think it's important to pay attention to. From the empathy standpoint, I do identify with seasonal employees who want career jobs. I started as a seasonal. The Chief of the Forest Service, Tom Tidwell, was a seasonal. We both moved into the career ranks and achieved the positions we have today. Many seasonals desire career positions. We want seasonals to fill career jobs. But it's also important to note that some seasonal employees do not look for a career in the Forest Service. There's a good percentage of employees that are attending school. They work in the summertime. There are teachers who teach during the school year and work in the summertime. And then there are others who have other pursuits that is complementary to a seasonal workforce. Now, back to the employees that do want a job, I do have a personal empathy. My son is a 5-year seasonal. He's very frustrated with the process of trying to become a career employee. He told me just last week he's sick of filling out job applications. So I can identify with that. We've had some tough love conversations about this very issue. And what I tell him are the 4 things that I tell anybody who asks me about getting a career job. You have to go where the jobs are. You have to do a job. You may have to do a job you don't want in order to get your foot in the career employment category. You should consider serving your country in the military and getting veterans preference, or joining the Peace Corps and coming back with a non-competitive placement authority, or consider going back to school. If you can't do one or more of these things, the reality is that you do limit yourself in pursuing a career position. So in closing, Mr. Chairman, let me just acknowledge that the union particularly, and I have discussed the issue of a pathway to permanence right now. Should the administration and Congress consider those type of incentives for long-term seasonals, we're happy to provide our input and take part in that dialogue. So that concludes my remarks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cashman. Ms. Bailey, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee, for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Office of Personnel Management regarding temporary employment in the federal government. Federal agencies use temporary appointments when they do not need an employee's services permanently. These appointments are used in a variety of circumstances, including when an office is scheduled to be reorganized or abolished to complete a specific short-term project or to meet peak workload demand. Some employees serving under temporary appointments are employed seasonally. That is, they work during certain times of the year on a reoccurring basis. The term seasonal refers to the employee's work schedules and not their appointment type. Some seasonal workers are temporary, while others serve under permanent appointments. I will elaborate on that in a moment. Temporary appointments are limited to 1 year or less. They can be extended for a maximum of 1 additional year. Generally, an agency may not fill a position by temporary appointment if that position has been filled by temporary appointment for an aggregate of 24 months within the preceding 3-year period. OPM regulations require that the supervisor of each position filled by temporary appointment must certify that the need for the position is truly temporary and that the appointment meets the regulatory time limits. The certification must include the specific reason for using a temporary appointment. Let me review why these limitations were imposed. Until 1985, temporary appointments were much like they are today. Appointments were limited to 1 year with a maximum 1-year extension. In 1985, OPM made several policy changes to give agencies greater flexibility to meet mission and budgetary challenges. From 1985 through 1994, temporary appointments could be extended for up to 4 years in 1-year increments. There was no limit on the number of times the position could be filled using temporary appointments. One of the consequences of this situation was that many temporary employees developed an expectation of continuing employment because agencies could appoint them to successive temporary appointments, sometimes for decades. One example of this was the tragic case of James Hudson, an employee of the National Park Service who died on the job. Because he was a temporary employee, albeit with more than 8 years of service, his family was not eligible for certain benefits they would have received had he been serving under a permanent appointment at the time of his death. OPM re-examined the use of temporary appointments and in 1994 revised the rules governing them. We prescribed the limitations I outlined in order to ensure that temporary appointments will be used for truly short-term hiring needs and to avoid the perception by employees that temporary employment could last indefinitely. Our regulations provide for limited exceptions from the time limits. Agencies can ask OPM for exceptions on a case-by-case basis only when required by major reorganizations, base closings, or other unusual circumstances. OPM requires agencies to submit a work-related justification for each request. In addition, OPM regulations provide an exception to the time limits for work that is expected to last less than 6 months each year. The reason for this exception is that some agencies need to be able to bring back some employees on a seasonal basis. In contrast to seasonal employees who work more than 6 months in a year and who therefore must be employed under permanent appointments, those who work less than 6 months a year may be given temporary appointments that can be renewed multiple times. This exception allows agencies to limit the number of permanent employees they hire while retaining the flexibility to employ seasonal workers whose services are needed for less than 6 months each year. A concern that is often raised with respect to employees serving under temporary appointments is that they are excluded from coverage under the retirement programs for federal employees. Retirement coverage is generally not in the interest of either these employees or the agencies they work for. This is true because of the requirement that an individual must work for at least 5 years in covered employment in order to become entitled to an annuity. Most temporary employees never fulfill this 5-year requirement, so it does not make sense for them to have contributions to the retirement system withheld from their pay. As is the case with retirement coverage, the laws governing the federal employees' health benefits and federal employees' group life insurance programs authorize OPM to exclude certain categories of employees from coverage based on the nature and type of their employment. Consequently, employees serving under temporary appointments are generally excluded from coverage under the health and life insurance programs. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss with you how temporary employment is used in the federal government and how and why it affects employee benefits. I would be happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. I want to welcome Mr. Bill Bray to this hearing. Let me start with you, Mr. Simpson. I understand from your testimony that a substantial number of your employees serve on a temporary basis. I do have to note the oxymoron, I guess, of career temporary employee. You got folks that are doing career-related jobs, but on a temporary basis. You have a general policy that was articulated by Ms. Bailey that says a person can work for a year with 1 additional year, and that's it, except that we allow a waiver, and now it's perpetual, apparently, for some of these employees. But I'm just wondering the impact on the employees, the morale of the employees, productivity, how they approach the job, and the impact on their families and the workers, and the peace of mind in terms of, the management and the workforce there, given the fact that a lot of these people are in limbo, they are continually reemployed as temporary workers without any benefits. How is that impacting the workforce, and how is that impacting the conduct of your responsibilities in the workplace?
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I think it's pretty clear that there are employees that are impacted by that. As Mr. Cashton mentioned, similarly to the Forest Service, we have a wide variety of circumstances represented in our seasonal workforce, and those issues are not true for all of our seasonals, but for those that it is true, it certainly can't be denied. It has an impact on morale.
Is it, you mentioned earlier you're oversubscribed for these temporary positions, so is it just too bad if you don't like it, we got somebody else who wants that job? Is that how we look at it?
I wouldn't say that we would look at it that way, no. Every manager makes their own decisions about who they hire, and there are a lot of individuals that are hired back because they want to come back and their manager that they worked for the previous season wants to have them back. That's one of the reasons why we have far more applications than we have available slots for the competitively advertised positions that we fill.
Mr. Cashton, you in the closing remarks, you said that if the administration were willing to, look at this rule again and change its policy, you'd be happy to participate. Well, this committee is doing just that. We've got a lot of complaints from workers that, that they've been in this limbo for a long time. They get rehired. They look at other folks that are doing the same jobs that they're doing, albeit, they're full-time, full year. But these folks are doing it over and over and over again, multiple years, and at the end of the day, you have the situation that was illustrated earlier about an employee who, for all intents and purposes, was continually reemployed, but was denied all these benefits because he fell in a different class. How do you feel? I mean, you're saying that 44% of your career positions are being occupied by temporary employees. Is that just a result of the seasonal nature, or are we looking at a strategy employed by management to really try to reduce their costs? And so if we can keep 44% of the people with no benefits, no health insurance, no retirement, no annuity, then we can manage our budget a lot better.
Mr. Chairman, let me clarify. I guess I didn't state that fact very well. What I meant to state was that of our career workforce, those who have career status, in other words, permanent employees, 44% of that career workforce came from the ranks of employees who previously were temporary seasonals.
Okay, so there is a path to...
Yes, and it's the largest single segment. I do think it's critical to have a variety of employment sources. Temporary seasonal employees are a very, very large part of the current career profile. That's where they came from. It's a very important source.
And that is notwithstanding the fact that, as in your testimony you said earlier, you've got veterans groups that you've got, you give priority to. You've got folks coming in from the Peace Corps, so they've got other, I guess, non-competitive status, right to appointments as well. And you're still getting 44% from the temporary workforce into career status.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. In fact, if you appreciate that a certain segment of our career workforce is administrative in nature, say 5,000 or 6,000 employees that don't have seasonal counterparts, those positions that are natural resource related, actually the number's up in the 55 to 56% range.
Okay. I have exhausted my time. I'm going to yield for 5 minutes to Mr. Bilbray.
Thank you. On the average, how many individuals do we have to apply for permanent positions? Anybody know? In your departments? I'd like to see a comparison between the permanent applications and the temporary applications. Can you give me some kind of reference? Do you have any idea of that?
Well, each year we fill approximately 350,000 positions. Of those, 150,000 are permanent. At any one given time, we're averaging around 450 people per job announcement, and I know that on average we have somewhere around 2 million people apply for our jobs each year. That's across the board, government-wide.
I mean, this discussion sort of sparked my interest. I spent 6 years as a seasonal worker. Of course, it's scary to think that somebody, when I started off in 1970, and he was an elderly person, almost 30 years old, was lifeguarding, that they're still out, the same people that I worked with in 1970, a lot of them are still seasonal workers doing the same thing. I guess the discussion is, one thing we don't think about, many seasonal workers, this is not their only employment. A lot of teachers, a lot of different type of seasonal professions, and they mix and match. Do you have any numbers at all of what portion of our seasonal workforce this is a second income?
No, I do not.
I don't have any specific data. I would, from my experience in working in the workforce, I would estimate that about half or more of our seasonals would ultimately desire a career job in the Forest Service. There are certainly those who don't, that I described in the testimony. There's even the one or two I run into now and then that look forward to working for 6 months and going to Mexico for 2 months, and start to wonder where I went wrong in that. But for the most part, it's there's a sizable number that ultimately want to achieve a career appointment in the Forest Service.
Every time I go down to Latin America, I agree with them, okay? Yeah, I think there's a legitimate concern here that the fact that this is not just a situation where people are living off of a few months of work. I just know that there are real estate agents who do this kind of thing. There are people that are teaching. There's a whole lot of different professions that find that that ability. People that are in property management can get into this. So I just think that a lot of this discussion is somehow focused on a perception that may not be reality. But the other issue is this 44%. You know, I'm just wondering how much of the complaints are people who think that if they get seasonal and work for a few years, that puts them in the pecking order to basically be moved up, which should be true if they're employees that we want to participate. But seeing that we have, how many applications do we have for temporary service in your department? 150? I mean, what was the number that you gave out?
Well, I was just saying that of the 350,000 that we fill each year, 200,000 of those are temporary or seasonal type.
But you don't know how many
appointments.
applications you have for those temporary?
No, on average, though, today, we get around 450 applications for every job that we announce.
Okay, so in other words, the market out there is very large. It's an employer's market when it comes to working for the government, even if it's seasonal, right?
Correct.
Okay. So there's enough people on the outside of the system who really think this is a really good deal, even though there may be those in the system, once they're in, feeling that it's not a very good deal. Is that fair to say? What's the turnover with our seasonal?
We, overall in the Forest Service, in the career ranks, we're looking at around a 5 or 6% attrition rate.
That's extraordinary.
It's fairly small. In the seasonal ranks, that's very hard to put your finger on because you're bringing in the factor of those who are not looking at it as a continuous long-term season after season approach. So I don't really have any data on.
Okay, just for the record, I find it extraordinary that we would want to limit seasonal workers for some reason. To how many years? I'm sorry. I still think the old guys that are there, that have been there for 30 years, are probably still the best lifeguards on that beach. And frankly, just because they keep coming back indicates that they do enjoy it, and we keep hiring means they're doing a good job. And I worry about this attitude that basically says that we don't expect seasonals to be around long. I think we wouldn't do that with our full-time employees. I hope we never do that with our seasonal. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bilbray. Chair now recognizes, we've been called for votes, so members will be leaving and coming back in, and I'm going to ask Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton to chair in my absence, but I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. Let me ask Ms. Bailey, is it your testimony today that abuses have in fact occurred using temporary hires?
No, it is not my testimony today.
So there
that
no abuses have occurred?
I cannot sit here.
Ma'am,
and
you're going to have to speak. I cannot hear you.
I'm sorry. No, we do not believe that abuses have occurred using this temporary appointment authority. Given our oversight and accountability role in this and working with the agencies, we do not believe that there have been abuses.
No abuses?
Correct.
Wow. Okay. Let me ask you a hypothetical question. If we do the census every 10 years, I'd ask it of the panel. Now, clearly, hiring temporary census workers for a period of a few months to undertake the initial data collection or to follow up on that data collection because it was inadequate or incomplete somehow, goes on every 10 years. And that, I think we would all agree, is clearly a temporary position. Would you consider it temporary, however, if we did a census every year and we hired that person for 6 months every year? Is that a temporary hire that, as far as you're concerned, perfectly legitimate and could go on until that person retires? Is that a correct use in the federal workplace of this category, temporary hire? Mr. Cashton?
I'm sorry, Mr. Conley. I thought that was a question for Ms. Bailey there.
I'm sorry. I was just opening up to any of you.
Okay. We use an appointment, we call it a 1039. I think the correct term is a less than 1,040 hours is the type of temporary authority we use that is specifically used for work that is seasonal and temporary in nature. Sometimes I think we overlay the issue of benefits with that. We do not use this authority for the purpose of denying benefits. If benefits were part of that, we'd still use the authority. We use this authority because it is particularly the one that is geared for work that is temporary and seasonal in nature, and we have quite a few of our seasonal employees that do work almost that right up to that 1,040 hours. And that's not to say it's not something that many of them are frustrated with. But,
yeah. I'm just asking a different question, though. I'm glad you told us about the practice, but at what point do we have to agree we're sort of doing an end run on the system and calling someone temporary? And what is the time limit for somebody to be in that status? I thought federal regulations, you went through, Ms. Bailey, in your testimony, changes in the law going back to the 80s, but is the current practice or the current law, as you understand it, literally ad infinitum? There's no limit?
If I could address your initial question with regard to the census takers, and if we hire them back each year, is that really truly temporary? In that particular case, what the current law and what our regulations allow for is an agency could make a decision to hire them either as temporary employees or as permanent employees, and either one could carry what we would call a seasonal work schedule. So in other words, if something is reoccurring every year, we would probably suggest to an agency that rather than use temporary employment, that you would make those permanent seasonal employees, or permanent because it is reoccurring.
Does the Forest Service do that?
In certain areas, actually particularly California is an example where we have career seasonals for exactly the reason that we're talking about here. Is the fire season could go very long, could go 6 months, it could go longer than that, and also for other reasons of trying to have a a workforce that we've been able to retain over a longer period of time, provide retention incentives. So there are areas where we do have career seasonals. Now, along those northern tier states where the work is primarily field, you'll find less of a profile that are career seasonal and more temporary seasonals. So it really varies with the work and the fluctuation in the work. In the forest products area, that work may fluctuate from year to year, and we don't know how many seasonals we'll need. In fire, it's fairly predictable.
My time is almost up, but Mr. Simpson, I want to give you a chance to respond.
I would echo what Mr. Cashton said. We also have a mixture of seasonals who are on career appointments as well as seasonals who are temporaries for the same reasons.
My time is up, Madam Chairman, and I thank you. I just want to say I am stunned by Ms. Bailey's testimony that they have never found, are not aware of, any abuse of the use of temporary hires. That's an extraordinary statement for a workforce as large as the federal government. Even a workforce as normally perfect as ours, there's got to be abuse now and then. And I think that's a challenge, frankly, for this committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bailey, would you like to revise your statement in any way? I mean, you just, my colleague says that you've just come up with a perfect system.
Well, yes, thank you. Thank you, ma'am. I think it is safe to say that we do have, through our oversight role, if we do find a situation where there is an abuse that is occurring, we will absolutely go in and work with that agency in an informal manner. We can do all kinds of things, from training the hiring managers to training the HR specialists.
Do you keep records of where you have found abuses?
Actually, yes. In our oversight, as part of our oversight and accountability, we keep records of all agencies where we have found a finding of a violation, and then we make a record of that for both the agency and for OPM.
Well, Ms. Bailey, it would be very helpful if you would submit to the subcommittee within the last, let's say, 2 years, to give us some sense of what kinds of
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. Conley.
Would you yield just for one point?
Indeed.
I thought Ms. Bailey's testimony, in answer directly to my question, was we have found no such examples, none. And now I'm hearing Ms. Bailey say, well, actually, when we find them, we do take corrective action. And if you wanted to correct your statement, please feel free to do so. But I'm leaving here with your answer under oath to my question that you have found no examples of the abuse of the use of temporary positions in the federal workforce.
And that, sir, I do not want to change. That is correct. We have not found one instance of an abuse under this authority.
Apparently, GAO data showed that 11% of the temporary employees had worked more than 5 years. Would you consider that an abuse?
Well, it really depends on exactly under what conditions these folks are working.
Well, they got a waiver. Keep getting a waiver. Wouldn't automatic waivers constitute an abuse?
I am not aware of any instance where an agency has abused the automatic waiver situation. They have applied it appropriately. Wherever we have actually used our oversight authority, they have applied it appropriately in accordance with the OPM regulations.
Well, then you're back to Mr. Conley's point that if they have applied it appropriately, you wouldn't have to go in and retrain and otherwise correct the abuse. That's the problem we have with your testimony.
Okay.
But I think that'll be clarified if you just do what I asked you to do. For the last 2 years, would you submit for the record? I understand there may be we may have a definitional problem. You may regard what an employee has, what a manager has done as a mistake. Whatever it is, we're not trying to play any gotcha here. We're just trying to see how the system works. So if you would provide for the chairman within 30 days a record of those instances where you, OPM, have gone in to assist managers or employees with respect to temporary hires. That would assist our record. Now, as I see it, this hearing is really about two things. One is benefits, and the other is the merit system. We see temporary employees as valuable. In fact, some places indispensable, as in the National Park Service, for example, or Forest Service. I'd be interested to know, though, Ms. Bailey, because we here have more typical, we have before us managers from more typical temporary service agencies. I'd like to know what percentage of temporary employees are outside of these seasonal, the seasonal area that we've just heard of, and where we see the critical need in order to function.
I am not sure of the exact percentage that is.
Well, we understand that they are in virtually every category, that agencies, far from just the Park Service or the Forest Service, the IRS and you name it, all feel free to use temporary employees. It would benefit our record to know what percentage come outside of these seasonal employees, and yet are temporary employees that are used across the government. Within 30 days, would you submit that information to the record? Mr. Cashton, I was interested in your testimony. It seemed reasonable that there were a fair number of people, even yourself, who came into the government first as seasonal employees and then became full employees. Now, our concern, of course, is how does this key with the merit system? Could you tell us in your case how you were able to become a merit system employee while beginning as a temporary seasonal employee? How were you able to compete?
Sure, Ms. Norton. Let me just clarify that even in the 6-month seasonal, there is an initial period where there is a competition, and you do have to go through a process where you consider such things as veterans preference, that kind of thing. But it is much, your probability of getting into the seasonal workforce is much more enhanced, and then after that you can be recurringly appointed if you are not exceeding the 1,040 hours. In my particular case, I applied, I don't even know if they have these anymore, but back in my time, I applied for what we called OPM rosters, and I was on a recurring list for civil engineering technicians, and at the point that the forest that I had in fact moved to in order to enhance my chances of getting a career job, they decided to fill the career job, went to the roster, and I was available, so I was able to be picked up off that roster. So the merit process was going through the OPM roster, being ranked and being entered on the roster, and that's how I got in. It's the same way that our chief, Tom Tidwell, got into.
So you were competing with people who had no experience.
I was competing. I'm sorry.
I shouldn't say who had no experience. Yeah. Who knows? Some of them may have had certain kinds of experience outside of the government. But you were competing with people who would have not had experience in the agency you wish to work for.
Yes, Ms. Norton, I was competing at that point in time. I believe I was a GS5, and in fact, I was on a GS4 roster. So I had some years. It didn't matter where those years were. They were experienced. It credited me and qualified me.
So that's what I want to get at. When you are competing on the merit side, and perhaps this is a question relevant for Ms. Bailey as well, to what extent does experience received on the seasonal or temporary side count or help employee to obtain permanent employment through the merit system?
Experience is something that counts regardless of how it's acquired. So if it's acquired under a seasonal appointment or a temporary appointment, or if it's acquired outside the federal government. So let's take a federal firefighter that it happens to be working on a seasonal basis. Not only would that experience count, if then in the wintertime they're also a firefighter with the city of New York, that experience, combined experience, would count and then give them credible experience toward whatever position position that they are applying for. So we don't make distinctions based on an appointment type or a work schedule. Experience is experience, no matter how it's gained.
Let me ask you, Ms. Bailey, at the time of the death of James Hudson, and the whole city was moved by this hardworking man who just kept working because he obviously needed to work with a family. So far as I can tell, all that happened was there was a cap put on the number of years a temporary employee could work consecutively. Is that right?
Yes, as part of our review of that particular case, and then in consultation with the agencies and discussing how best to balance both the mission accomplishment with what is in the best interest of the employees, that is correct, that we did put in our temporary employment regulations allow for 1 year of employment and then 1 year extension. And the whole intent of this was to get...
Although I've just quoted you numbers that show a healthy number who work 5 years. When they work 5 years, is that because there's a shortage? Or is it because these employees are regarded as the workplace usually regards employees? They're looking for experienced people, and so they keep picking these people up.
It may depend, ma'am, on which kind of appointment that they're actually using. If it's some of the agencies are able to, given the other exception that is in our temporary employment rules, is that if they are working 6 months or less, which is the 1040 or less, if they are working that, then we do allow for indefinite 1 year extensions at a time, and that's how someone could work up to 5 years.
Mm-hmm. I see. So you think they may be in that category?
Yes. I mean, given the situation that you described, I do.
I think James Hudson's death raised rather definitively the notion of benefits, however, so much so that Congress, in fact, gave Mr. Hudson's wife and children benefits, $34,000, retirement benefits, in effect. Mm-hmm. That's one man. There's never been retirement benefits given for any other person, has there?
Not that I'm aware of.
That was a remedy because for a man who dropped dead on the job. Now, let me ask you, in light of the health care legislation that just passed, has OPM looked at health care for temporary workers, or are they to be considered outside of the penumbrum of a bill that claimed to cover 95% of the American people?
We have actually discussed this whenever the administration when President Obama's administration first came in. We had the Recovery Act, and at that point in time we had issued a Schedule A authority for agencies to use to hire temporary workers to come in and to assist with the Recovery Act. And at that time the question did come up with regard to health benefits, and so we took a very good close look at both our regulations and the law. And the way the law is currently written, it is written in such a way that it excludes temporary employees from receiving health benefits.
Private and public sector, you're saying?
Oh, I'm only speaking to federal sector. I cannot speak to private sector.
In testimony before us, one or all of you have indicated that after a while, perhaps a year, you can get health insurance if you, the worker, are willing to pay for it. You can get in the FEHBP, Fair Employees Health Benefit Plan, if you are willing to pay for it. Is that right?
Yes, after 1 year, even temporary employees are eligible to apply for health benefits as long as they pay the 100% contribution of that. So in other words,
why would there not be a shared benefit for these employees? Why would the federal government employ people and pick up? Well, first let me ask you, what percentage of people in these temporary jobs, which are not your highest paid job in the federal government, in fact take on coverage 100% of the health care costs? How many? What percentage do that?
I don't have the answer to that,
I would
ma'am.
think you'd want to know after Mr. Hudson's death. It may be a quite empty promise. What is the policy reason behind the notion of coverage if you want it but don't ask us to contribute anything to it? What's the justification for that?
In this particular instance, we're not unsympathetic to this issue, and we would be more than willing to work with the subcommittee with regard to health benefits for these federal employees.
I appreciate that, Ms. Bailey. We understand the difficulty raised here. Episodic employees will always present issues when it comes to benefits of various kinds. One can even understand the retirement notions and how difficult that would be, but then there's Social Security. I understand that seasonals, however, don't receive any access to the Fair Employment Health Benefit Plan. Is that right?
If they are permanent seasonal employees,
What is that?
permanent seasonal would be a permanent employee who works seasonal, meaning more than 6 months or more.
I see, but there are over 1,000 less than 6-month seasonal employees. The number we have, Mr. Cashton, Mr. Simpson, those less than 6-month employees have no access to health care?
Let me clarify. There are career seasonals and there are temporary seasonals. Career seasonals do get health benefits if they have career status in the federal workforce. They do get health benefits, life insurance. Those under temporary appointment, non-career status, that as Ms. Bailey mentioned, if they are in an appointment that is where they work less than a year, they don't get health benefits. So the large amount of our temporary seasonal workforce is in fact a 6-month or less type category, the 1,040 hours, and they do not qualify for benefits under the regulations.
Now, I recognize, I don't know, some of these may be, I think it was you, Mr. Caston, who said that, you could have teachers who are seasonally out of work for themselves, and so they pick up seasonal work. They may, in fact, have health care. We do need to understand, in light of the health care bill, how many people we're talking about that simply don't have health care, that we're carried on the rolls of the federal government. This would be a terrible embarrassment, it seemed to me, to have another James Hudson type incident. I don't mean death. I mean someone becomes seriously ill on the job, happens to be a federal employee, a seasonal employee, and has no access to health care, despite the fact that we've touted the health care bill as covering almost everybody. We have to understand that this is a very different workforce. The workforce of pensioners who work full-time, I'm sure that may have been the case for the federal government at some point, or something close to it. That's a workforce of the past. And I'm not sure, Ms. Bailey, that OPM has looked at this new workforce as in light of benefits and in light of status. It's going to be important for us to know how many of these seasonals, these less than 6-month seasonals, have health care. Now, we know they don't have health care from the federal government, but they may have health care. So we need to have an accurate picture. I don't even know if we have a problem. We may, and if we do, it does seem to me that the first workforce that would have to take account of it would be the federal workforce. We probably have this problem throughout the United States. We have sought in the health care bill to correct this problem for seasonal workers on some part of the country, I might add. But then if we're sitting on such an issue ourselves, it would be an embarrassment and worse for the federal government. I'd like to dismiss this panel. Thank you for very helpful testimony on an issue that we are confronting anew, and you have enriched our record. Thank you very much.